Higher cognitive functions involve the cortex, and I got to pick up my brain off the floor here. But this is the outer bark of the brain right here. It sort of fits in your skull like this, right? These are the frontal lobes. My eye, that's right behind my forehead. My eyeballs are kind of right below here. The temporal lobe is right here along my temples. The very back of the brain we're going to see is the occipital lobe, and this portion right here between the occipital and the frontal lobe, we're going to see this is the parietal lobe. And networks that are going to be involved in complex cognitive aspects of our experience, aspects of perception, felt aspects of the body, decision-making, memory. They're going to involve networks that are actually distributed across multiple lobes. However, there are some things we can say, some sort of functional associations we can make with some of the specific lobes of the brain. And I want to walk through just briefly, some of these associated perceptions and aspects of cognition that are associated with each of these lobes. There's also a hidden lobe that's kind of deep inside here. Well, I'll show you in more detail in a moment, but this right in here is called the insular lobe, and that's also going to play a very important role in drug dependence, drug addiction, and drug use disorders. So the frontal lobe, though, is something that is associated with a couple of pretty clear aspects of of how we work. For one thing, any kind of sort of voluntary motor engagement, so any voluntary sort of behavior, if you're making a sort of conscious decision to move or do something, the commands largely come out of the frontal lobe, and the sort of preparation of what it is you're going to do or express also involves networks that are localized in the frontal lobe. So we often talk about the frontal lobe being critically involved in social decision making, and social decision making. Obviously, that's going to play a drug. Drug use disorders are going to involve very specific forms of social decision making. Often a failure to sort of consider consequences to the same degree. So consideration of consequences, social consequences, that then influences or inhibits maybe the sort of driven behavior that you might like to engage in. That's a very important aspect of the frontal lobe function. And one of the things that has great relevance to drug use disorders and the development of drug use disorders and the risk taking, the social risk taking associated with drug experimentation. We're going to see that during adolescence, when there's significant growth and elaboration, and reaching out and synaptogenesis, the formation of many new synapses, and then the sort of pruning down those synapses based on experience, often based on the consequences of the risks that you are taking, right? That actually will hone down and change the connectivity of these networks so that you are learning about what the consequences of different, actions might be. It's unfair to adolescents to expect that they know what those consequences will be, even if you tell them. Just say no, for example, that's not always as effective as actually taking the risk and then experiencing the consequence. Those powerful changes along synaptic connections alter the structure of those synapses in ways that better, prepare you for future experiences that might be similar, to what came before. So I want to show you this. This is like a 3D print of a brain of an adolescent in the Portland area. This is part of the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study that, OHSU is one of the partners in pursuing this research on the changing, structural aspects of, adolescent brains, and also their functional changes. I want you to see, this is the frontal lobe of a local adolescent. This is pretty wide, right? You can see it's sort of a wide, there's a lot of synapses here. And then you look at the adult, right? This is off the NIH website. It's significantly narrowed down, right? You can actually see structurally some of the changes that have occurred. If I put them next to each other, that adolescent, there's a lot more brain there, and there's a lot more potential in some ways here, a lot more plasticity. The the adolescent is driven to take significant risks while this frontal lobe is developing, and then ultimately it'll get honed down to this. The problem we're going to see with drugs is that they get into some of these synapses and they overwhelm decision making. They sort of produce very initially very motivating sort of consequences, rewarding sort of consequences, and you can wire behavior around obtaining more of the drug, when really a lot of this is being honed because of social experiences, like having fun with your friends, learning to play instruments or play sports or work with other people, and you want these networks to develop in ways that are actually very beneficial ultimately to you and to everybody else, hopefully. So anyway, the frontal lobe is really important for social decision making, and during adolescence, there's a great deal of plasticity in this region and a great deal of development underway. There is a kind of a strip right here. It's a valley. It's basically where the cortex on the surface sort of folds down and then comes back up. Well, this is the Latin for valley is a sulcus. The surface region here is called a gyrus, and this centrally located sort of sulcus or valley, this is called the central sulcus. And the central sulcus is a sort of a cortical landmark that separates out the frontal lobe, which is more anterior towards the front of your head here, from the more posterior parietal lobe. This is this region of sulci and gyri that are localized right back here. And this gyrus that's just before the central sulcus, this is called the pre-central gyrus. There's an actual map, basically, of the other side of your body, actually, in terms of motor output, direct sort of motor output. So this region actually has a lot of these great big cells that are called pyramidal cells that have their axons that go down and leave the brain, go into the brain stem and into the spinal cord to synapse on motor neurons to go out and actually move your body around and generate all of this behavior. And we're going to see so motor planning, voluntary motor sort of execution, through this motor strip right here, social decision making, inhibition of sort of inappropriate kinds of social expressions or behaviors. All of these are aspects of frontal lobe function. Now, in the parietal lobe, we actually have a lot of important sensory information sort of converging. There is, just over that central sulcus is another gyrus, and this gyrus is called the post-central gyrus. It's after the central sulcus. And there's an analogous map of the opposite side of your body, but in terms of sort of touch and proprioceptive sort of position information input. So, if I touch over here, well, the somatosensory strip in that first gyrus in the parietal lobe, just post the central sulcus, there'll be a specific portion that corresponds to that part of my body on that somatosensory map. And so there's a lot of somatosensory information, particularly about touch and position, that's going to be feeding into the parietal lobe. But also we're going to see, while the occipital lobe is all the way at the back, that's where visual information initially arrives. And then visual information is shared, in both the temporal lobe we're going to see, but also into the parietal lobe, specifically about sort of motion and sort of position. And there's also what we call vestibular information coming into this lobe, into the parietal lobe, which is, information about acceleration, both linear and angular acceleration, like turning in different directions, gravity. So the parietal lobe builds up a very critical sort of spatial map of where your body actually happens to be in relationship to other objects, people, events, etc., that are occurring in your environment. And drugs can certainly impact by acting on the frontal lobe, social decision making can influence, motor activity, your ability to inhibit, inappropriate emotional expression. But in the parietal lobe, they can often have sort of spatial distortions. There's a series of syndromes people can have when they have disruption of parietal function called Alice in Wonderland syndromes, where they, feel like Alice who fell down, the hole and, took drugs, eat me, drink me. And then all of a sudden everything got very, she got very big and everything got very small, or she got very small, and everything got very big. I feel small. So the parietal lobe is often involved in those aspects of sort of spatial distortion in response to drugs. And then the occipital lobe, again, we can talk about it primarily being involved with sort of the initial processing of incoming visual information. And then the temporal lobes along here are critically important for, again, visual information coming in to the occipital lobe, but then getting distributed through neural networks into the temporal lobe that are important for recognizing objects. So like, this is a brain model, right? Or that's, my mother, or this is my friend, right? Or that's a cup. There's a distribution of information. There's a organization of temporal lobe cortical regions around, various recognition of various categories of objects. This is also where auditory information arrives initially into cortex. So we're going to have, significant areas that are devoted to, sounds and processing sounds. And also in the medial temporal lobe, the medial portion of the temporal lobe, you're going to have areas that are critically involved in memory, particularly memory for facts and events or specific episodes of your life. So this is there's an area in here called the hippocampus that's extremely important for kind of episodic or explicit or declarative memory for facts and events and for specific episodes in your life. So the temporal lobe, really important for recognizing objects, for hearing, for memory. And then the other lobe that's kind of hidden sort of deep inside, this great big fissure right here. This is called the lateral, because it's on the side, fissure. You can go through here. There's actually a lot of sulci and gyri kind of hidden through. I'm going to drop off a cerebellum here in a second. But if you go through here, there's actually a whole set of cortex deep inside this lateral fissure that's known as the insular lobe. And the insular lobe plays a pretty significant role in responses to drugs, because it's where a lot of these visceral afferents, like the gut, the enteric nervous system, somatosensory body sensation information about injury or temperature will get mapped in the insula. So it's really an important, network that's involved in how you feel, right? So that's pretty critical for, responses